So I study social media, which means to a first approximation, I watch people argue.
I think this is a revolution, right? I think that this is a really profound change in the way human affairs are arranged, and I use that word advisedly.
Every time a new consumer joins this media landscape, a new producer joins as well, because the same equipment, phones, computers, let you consume and produce it.
Okay, let's start from the mid-1990s.
Okay.
In your first book,
Yep.
The Voices from Net.
So I had started using the internet in the early 1990s when the web was starting to spread like wildfire. This growing sense that the web wasn't just a new application. It wasn't that we had Usenet and mailing lists and now we had the web, but that the web was starting to absorb everything. Later that year, the first visual browser came out. It's called Nixa Mosaic. There was suddenly this sense that the internet was not just a thing to be interested in, but it was a thing to work on. When the mobile internet began coming along, first Wi-Fi and laptops, and then of course now mobile phones and large screens, it turns out that the conception of cyberspace was not only wrong, it was almost completely backwards. In fact, what happens is that the internet is suffusing the real world so completely that we now don't even really think of ourselves as using it any longer. There was a fascinating study. Many people who use Facebook don't know that they're using the internet. It's just working itself into every crack of human desire for information, human desire for commerce, human desire for social life. It's not this big blocky thing that you go to. It's the glue that holds the other bricks of life together. I think Peter was wrong. If we got flying cars, we'd be able to go faster. But the kinds of social changes that come from society exposing itself to more points of view, having different kinds of arguments, entertaining different ways of settling questions, that's where the really big changes come from. Right now, in the United States, we are in the middle of a civil rights revolution around police treatment of African Americans. There's been event after event. The liberal part of the nation decided that this was the problem to be worked on now. You can't even tell that story without using the word hashtag. When I was growing up, America worshipped big infrastructure. We could blow up an island, we could get to the moon. Both these huge, expensive projects. The things that actually changed the world I grew up in were the transistor and the birth control pill, right? Little tiny things. The world from the perspective of a billionaire, from an Elon Musk or a Peter Thiel, looks like, I just wish I could change the big parts of the system. But when we look back at the internet, what has changed things? Email. Web access, right? It's the stuff that the individuals adopt. If you change what people fight about and how they fight, which the internet is quite visibly doing, you change society. Now the social media is there, that people are friends with each other, connected to each other, but it's behind the application. I think that doesn't get replaced, it just fades into the background, but that structured collaboration, more formal groups of people who come together not just to hang out but to get things done. If the software knows where you are, and the software knows where your friends are, and the software knows where your friends' friends are, you can get something like a sort of social superpower. You can see through walls and see where groups of people are coming together. We're leaving the world where the internet has predictable phases and obvious centers, that it's suffusing so many different things, that a lot of the inventiveness now is around smaller subcultures and groups rather than lots of big new platforms. There's a whole Korean subculture that my students have just put me onto of people who eat ramen on camera and talk to their audiences, right? These are not going to become worldwide phenomena where we all are talking about the Korean ramen eaters. But for many people, that becomes the new center of their life. The niche applications, the subcultural applications, the specific applications increasingly become central to different people's lives. And I think are leaving the world where everyone who uses the internet has the same or a similar experience as everyone else who uses it, and entering a world where internet use is as variable as reading. Around centralization. Many people have observed, right, that the money is converging, that the organizations are converging. What Facebook controls is, it's 1.3 billion people, something like that. I forget what it is. Roughly the population of China, amazingly. And yet no one experiences Facebook as I'm talking to 1 billion people, right? You're on Facebook, you're talking to your 24 friends. And so you get these services that are at the level of the infrastructure vastly enormous. But when I'm a Baidu Tieba user, I'm just looking at the conversations I care about, right? If somebody is spending all their time on Baika and I'm spending all my time on Tieba, yeah, we're both Baidu users, but our actual day-to-day experiences don't overlap almost at all. And so the centralization, in a way, is increasingly hidden from the public, and our experience is the range of things that we can do is increasing, and we're, joining these subcultures. It used to be that if you wanted to have a lot of different experiences, you had to have a lot of different companies. Now the ideal internet company is producing an incredible range of experiences so that the centralization becomes economic and technological, but the decentralization becomes experiential and cultural. For a long time I said, I don't know. Now my answer is GitHub. Which is a tool for programmers to collaborate around writing software. And that sounds super arcane and like it's for a small group of people, but what GitHub has actually done is created the first working model for collaboration since the wiki that is general purpose, to my eye. And when you look at what Xiaomi has done, right, their first year and a half as a company, they didn't even make hardware, right? They were just working on MIUI. They were just working on their modified version of Android. That is a GitHub-like pattern of collaboration where the radius of what an organization can learn expands outwards from its own employees to include really significant input from its users. I think the social media thing is going to back into the way companies run themselves on the inside via these kind of collaborative experiments, of which I think GitHub is the most interesting, but there are lots of others. There is Stack Overflow, which is a question answering site. There are all of these various tools being worked out for collaboration. And the change in the way organizations run themselves, not just talk to the outside world, I think is the next big change. The one thing that has stayed constant with the leaders of whatever the leading companies are is that they're engineers. What's different is you understand the machine plus what. In the case of Windows, what they needed to understand was how to make the machine work. They didn't have to figure out much about making the machine work well. Apple, they could turn their attention to how do you make the machine work well for the individual user. Apple is engineering plus the individual. Facebook is engineering plus social. Engineering plus what? And when you get that right, that's what puts a company in the position of being one of the leading companies of its era, a company that essentially not only sets the rules for itself, but exports those rules to change the environment everyone else is operating. My students now are more passive about what's possible because they assume that other people will invent it or that most of what's going to be invented has already been invented. Ellen Ullman wrote about this many, many years ago, and still the best piece about software design ever written called Closer to the Machine. And in Closer to the Machine, she says, the better your software works, the dumber the designer thinks you are. Because the more times they said to themselves, could the user be dumb enough to do X? And then said, yeah. And so they make sure that X doesn't cause you a problem. To me, right now, there's 3 stories in China that will tell us about the globalization of the internet. Alibaba, WeChat, and Xiaomi. And all of those are companies that in one way or another have made a product that is perfectly suited to China today, but that operate at a scale, at an efficiency that could easily move to other markets. But the difference between China and those other markets then become the real negotiation. So if it ends up being 0 for 3, right, none of those 3 successfully globalized, that will say China is essentially just a different kind of market. You can certainly succeed here, and that will generate enormous fortunes, but it's not a launching pad for global commercial internet use. If all 3 of them succeed in globalizing, then China has become the new launch pad for mid-market countries, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia. And then if, as is likely, their success is different between Alibaba, WeChat, and Xiaomi, then we're really going to get a sense of what the next phase of the wiring up and connecting of the world is going to look like. The major obstacle for Xiaomi is that they have benefited from being in an environment where it is not easy for Ericsson or Apple to sue them. And in fact, once they moved to India, bam, here comes the Ericsson lawsuit, and they had to shut down for a minute. And, all of that negotiation. They're having to negotiate the different international waters, which is mainly about legal issues. Alibaba's problem is that the Chinese financial infrastructure is so unusual. Alipay is not an extendable model by and large because other countries don't need the same set of services that Alipay provides. And then for WeChat, there is some, on both sides now of the China-US divide around both hardware and software, there's deep suspicion that any product that comes from the other country is designed to spy on. That's something that Tencent will also have to overcome if it wants WeChat to move outside the Chinese borders. That in the short term, the printing press broke more things than it fixed. Right, that it pitched the world into a period of uncertainty where people, in just a literally descriptive way, did not know what to think. Certainly, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera, by doing this trick of assembling tiny, unreliable parts into a very robust and reliable whole, that makes the labor union pattern really hard. I think that short term, a lot of systems that we rely on and are happy with are going to get broken. But I am also optimistic in the long term because, in a way, the new solutions to the new problems created by the printing press led to a society that was dramatically much more curious, dramatically much more intellectually focused, where people were dramatically much richer and dramatically much better off and longer lifespans. I think we will be able, I hope, we will be able to negotiate our way through that change again. I will probably be dead before we know, so maybe my grandchildren will invent some way to speak beyond the grave and let me know what happened.